I want to begin our conversation about doing good and doing better with a poem by Herbert Levine entitled For the New Year. From evening till morning till evening the world revolves. Nature self-corrects, but will I? There's much to atone for in how I manage my world. The absence of a God is no excuse. No law nor judge, said Cain in his heart, and killed his brother to test his claim. Cain was asked, "Where are you?" I too check whether I am bent or upright. Difficult to be a sheep without a shepherd, David said in his heart, so he prayed to a God to guide his walk. To forge a soul is lonely work, suitable for a shepherd. I am the only sheep that I can guide. It is said that Abraham, during his wanderings, planted a tamarisk and asked it many questions. I try to live without illusions. That's all the legacy I leave my children. There's a challenge to doing good as a humanist. We have no absolute authority telling us what to do. To forge a soul is indeed lonely work, and yet it is work that must be done. As Levine points out, the absence of a God is no excuse for how much we have to atone and how we manage our worlds. Levine also reminds us that biblical heroes, the heroes of our past, are not always perfectly good people. Think about the character of Joseph. Joseph is proud and haughty with his father and his brothers. He torments them over Benjamin. In the end, he reconciles with them. But his invention of slavery to ensnare the Egyptians ultimately ensnares the Jewish people as well. Consider David, the hero of David and Goliath, the deceitful manipulator of others in his reign as king. Why does the Bible have so many flawed heroes? If heroes are flawed, they are more human, in some ways more relatable to us. One of the theses of my doctoral dissertation on Midrash, on creative stories based on the Bible in modern times, held that humanizing even God makes the character more relatable to us. And after all, we cannot do better until we admit we are not perfect. Doing good and then doing better is the theme of High Holidays. It's the goal of any moral education. But if we want to become a better person, it depends on what we define as being a good person. We need a baseline to look at improvement. And the ideals of good behavior can actually contradict each other. Consider these sets of opposing values that are both true in that old rabbinic version. A good person is someone who is humble and modest, someone who puts others' needs before their own, someone who works for the good of the group. That's one definition of being good. And at the same time, a good person is someone with personal dignity, someone with a strong sense of themselves, someone who is brave enough to disagree with consensus and to challenge the status quo, someone who is independent in mind and in deed. They seem to be opposites, but they're both true. Another pairing. A good person is someone who is willing and able to re-examine their actions, to accept criticism as feedback, someone who does not assume they always have the answers or were always right. At the same time, a good person is someone who does not dwell on their past failures, someone who is able to move forward with confidence even after mistakes and misdeeds. And the last pairing. A good person helps you when you need it, generously giving what they might use for themselves to other people who need it more than they do. And at the same time, a good person is someone who encourages you to live your best life, who trains you to be self-sufficient without them. Now, can a person do both sides of this ledger? Can they be both generous and affirming of the dignity of others? Of course. Wisdom is the art of knowing when to do what, when to help someone up, and when to push them to help themselves for their own self-esteem. These are issues that Jewish culture and Jewish thought has rich examples of delving into. There are many discussions on the basic statement, love your neighbor as yourself. Who counts as your neighbor? What does it mean to love someone else like you love yourself? What does it mean to love yourself? How do you balance their needs and your own needs? What does it mean to show love to someone? As one example of this from a later generation, the famous Jewish philosopher and Rabbi Maimonides created what he called the ladder of tzedakah, or the ladder of charity. And in this version, he is trying to articulate how best to give. Now, tzedakah actually has many meanings in Jewish life. It means charity, but it also means righteousness, and sometimes it means justice. The famous line, "Justice, justice you will pursue," that, as some may know, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had on the wall of her chambers, in Hebrew is tzedek, tzedek tirdof, just like tzedakah. So it means justice, it means doing the right thing, being righteous. It also means to do charity. And in Maimonides' Book of Laws, he tried to articulate different levels of what is most important in doing charity. We'll actually start at the bottom with the lowest one, even though he started high and went down. We'll start low and build up. So the lowest level that Maimonides articulates is to give to someone who needs it looking unhappy. So you don't want to give it, but you give it because you have to. That's like paying your taxes, okay? That's the lowest level of charity. A little bit better than that is to give to the person who needs it less than what is appropriate, but with a happy face. So maybe you could afford to give more, but you give them $5. You give them something, at least it's giving something. A little bit better than that is to give to someone what is appropriate to give them after being asked. So if someone asks you for help and you give them what they need. And of course, even better than that is to give to them directly before one is asked. But there are stages even higher. One can not just do good like this, but do even better. When the poor knows from whom he is taken and the giver does not know. This is like the great ones of the sages who would wrap the money in their sheets and roll them up behind them. And the poor would come and take the money so they would feel no shame. You can imagine them sort of having their money on their shoulders and it falls behind them so they don't see who picks it up, but the person receiving it knows who gave the money. An even better version than this. When the giver knows to whom he is giving and the poor person doesn't know from whom he is taken, and so he doesn't feel obligated. This is like the great ones of the sages who would go secretly to leave money in the doorways of the poor. This is the proper way and preferable if those supervising tzedakah are not behaving properly. So if you don't have an anonymous way to give it, do it this way, and you leave it at their door. They don't know who left it. They don't feel obligated, but the giver knows who received it. But even better than that, one who gives tzedakah to the poor and doesn't know from whom he is given, to whom he is given, and the poor person doesn't know from whom he has received. This is a mitzvah for its own sake. For this there was a secret chamber in the Jerusalem temple where the righteous would give in secret, and from which the poor of good families would secretly take their support. Imagine a closed box, like a little free library, right? You put something in, nobody knows who put it in. You take it out, nobody knows who takes it, but it's an anonymous giving and receiving. And then there is the highest level, the highest of the 8 that Maimonides articulates. The best level, greater than which there are none. This is the person who strengthens the hand of a poor Israelite by giving him a gift or a loan, or making a business partnership with him, or finding him work to strengthen his hand until he no longer needs to borrow and beg. You can recall the Confucian wisdom, teach a man to fish, he can fish for a lifetime, but give a man a fish, he only eats for a day. And so in some ways, Maimonides' level of charity is a wonderful articulation of this balancing act of giving and generosity and encouraging others to self-sufficiency. And sometimes to get to self-sufficiency, you require some generosity to start. Now, all of these levels of tzedakah count on Maimonides' scale, but he would articulate there's a way to do it better. The more you learn, and the more you learn how to give with the dignity of the other in mind. And of course, the highest level is also the highest amount of dignity you can provide to the person who needs help. Another example from Jewish life is from a rabbi who lived in the 19th century, born in 1803, I believe, lived till the 1890s. His name was Israel Salanter. He started a school of Jewish ethical thought called Musar. And this was based in Eastern Europe originally through a yeshiva system. And the goal of Musar was an ethical self-perfection. And it was based on a rigorous self-critique and evaluation. And so you would say to yourself, did I do as well as possible this week? And the next week you would do the same, and you would try to purify your soul, your ethics, your behavior, your emotions, to all be focused on doing the best you could possibly do. The virtues that he outlined included simplicity, kindness, generosity, giving to others. Salanter was very astute in his writings. He talked about the impact of emotions on ethical decision-making. When one is angry, one is less likely to act ethically. When one is upset, these can affect how we make these decisions. It was very wise of him to articulate that. And he also emphasized that interpersonal rules were just as important as divine rules. It said it didn't make any sense to be pious and pray 3 times a day if you weren't treating your fellow on the street correctly. He found a better balance between the obligations in traditional Jewish thought, ben adam lemakom, between a person and God, and ben adam lechavero, between a person and their fellow. He re-emphasized the importance of ethics between people. And he even alludes to a subconscious process, such that meditation and concentration can help making those decisions even below the level of the conscious thought process we have. And this is, again, decades before Freud began his work. However, we should also point out that traditional Musar was not just focused on ethical purification dealing with others. It was also focused on an inner spiritual refinement, as he put it. Piety, absolute faith and confidence in God, rigorous adherence to religious practices and purity laws. As Israel Salanter himself put it, spiritual life is superior to physical life, but the physical life of another is an obligation of my spiritual life. So there was a focus on the inner spiritual, the divine, the supernatural, as much as a focus on the interpersonal as well. So one example of this was one of his principles of humility and modesty. But modesty in this context didn't only mean not bragging about yourself. It also meant wearing modest clothing and bodily exposure. And if you ever have the chance to talk to or hear the accounts of women who grew up in Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, what the life was like for them dealing with the modesty police. We think it's only an institution in Iran. It also happens in Brooklyn and in parts of Jerusalem as well. Because if their elbows were showing or their collarbone was showing or too much of their leg was showing, they could be in trouble for violating these principles of modesty and refinement, right? And their sense of women's dignity. So here's an example of one of his teachings, a story he told that was passed on by his disciples that could be positive or could be oppressive. Receive every human being with a cheerful and pleasant countenance, it says in the sayings of the fathers. We read many sayings from that in our service tonight. And Rabbi Israel Salanter taught that the expression on our face can affect the mood of those around us. So our face is considered public domain, and it's not private. One Yom Kippur evening, the rabbi met a person on the way to synagogue for Kol Nidre prayers, and he greeted him warmly. But the other person was so absorbed with the solemnity and the fear of the Day of Atonement, he did not return the rabbi's greeting. In fact, he had a gloomy expression on his face as he contemplated the seriousness of divine judgment. Rabbi Salanter remarked to his disciple with him, "Why must I suffer because of his preoccupation with the divine judgment?" Rabbi Salanter was teaching his disciple that regardless of our mood, we have a responsibility to greet everyone with a cheerful and pleasant countenance, as it says in Pirkei Avot. Now, when I read this passage, I thought to myself, this is like telling people, you should smile more. What business is it of you if I smile or not? Can't I have my own feelings decide? Should I care more about my impact on you than on how I'm feeling? Well, it is true our attitude toward others does impact them. I can see that side of the argument, but I can also see how the teaching cannot be affirming of my own needs. It's, in a way, self-effacing beyond reason. We understand that we affect other people. Martin Buber in the 20th century wrote about the importance of an I-thou relationship, treating other people as people and not as things to simply be talked to or ignored or listened at instead of listened to. There is even today a Center for Contemporary Musar, which has tried to take the teachings of Israel Salanter and apply them in a modern setting. And I'll show you one of the pages on their site. This is their Musar Essentials page. As they say here, the practice of Musar is a discipline of character development. CCM's Musar is based on the precept that true joy only comes as the result of serving the other. And so we cultivate appropriate ways to do this. We want to replace the habits of self-service and self-protection with service to others. And so we transform ourselves by serving the other. And they list a whole set of 18 midot, or attributes, which we'll look at in a moment, that can be meditated upon, can be studied, and can be worked on in a kind of self-critique, self-improvement model. But again, many of these could be reasonable, could be positive, or could be negative if taken to extremes or with external religious authority imposing them upon you. So, for example, we have orderliness. Again, can be helpful, can be harmful. Deliberation, patience, right action, equanimity, moderation, silence, and considered speech. Think before you talk. A good lesson for many Jews, by the way, not just for those interested in Musar. Frugality, decisiveness, diligence, trust, cleanliness, humility, truthfulness, calmness, modesty, that's that word snoot that's used as a weapon sometimes against women in those Orthodox communities, preshut, separation, and generosity. So you can see how many of these values need to be in balance with each other. I mean, you'll notice there's frugality and generosity at the same time. There's silence and right action. There's patience and decisiveness. We need to find the right times and places for all of those values as we live with each other. You see, the key point to understand today is that becoming a better person is a moving target with no one bullseye. It starts with honesty and self-evaluation. It continues with a clarification of one's core values. And then we must work toward those values, toward those goals with patience and self-forgiveness and self-judgment. In traditional Kabbalah, Jewish mystical thought, it was imagined that God had two attributes, an attribute of mercy and an attribute of justice. And if the world were run only by justice, nothing would survive because everything fails. But if the world ran only by mercy, there would be no improvement and there would be no fairness in the world. And so too with our lives. Instead of projecting them onto the universe, let's apply them to ourselves to find that balance of justice and mercy, of self-advocacy and generosity to others. So I want to end with another poem by Herbert Levine, and this one connects with the double meaning today of the word mitzvah, as we celebrate a bar mitzvah tomorrow morning. For us, mitzvah has a dual meaning of commandment, but also good deed. To do a mitzvah is not only one of the 613 that the rabbis defined. From our perspective, even if ethics are only a human creation by human beings, they are what we have to learn how to do good and to do better. And so this is Levine's adaptation of the traditional Torah blessing, but in a humanistic key. This is the Torah. This is the Torah that was written by human beings over many generations, that Ezra put before the people of Israel in the name of Moses, that Hillel summarized hundreds of years after Ezra. What is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. The rest is commentary that's worth studying, and afterwards, do what needs doing. Our ancestors were right when they said that one mitzvah leads to another, and likewise a misdeed. This I know from the mistakes of my life. I don't believe in a commander, but the language of thou shalt reminds me that we inherited the mitzvot in order to be refined, like silver in the hands of the smith, like gold separated from its dross. Let us all do good and then do better.